Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I remember that night clearly, though it feels almost like a dream now. Soft, gray, and damp, with rain sliding down the windows of the city like cold fingers. I had missed my usual train, the one that would take me across the city in the comfort of familiar routes and predictable stops. The station was quiet, almost abandoned, with only a few scattered commuters and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The rain outside was relentless, drumming a slow, steady rhythm against the platform roof. It was the kind of rain that leaves your clothes clinging to your skin and makes the world feel heavier, as though every sound is swallowed by the damp air. I glanced at the timetable, and there it was, the last train, nearly empty, waiting silently at the far end of the platform. Its lights glimmered weakly through the mist, casting long, trembling shadows on the wet concrete. I walked toward it, my shoes splashing quietly in shallow puddles. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, almost too gentle, and I stepped inside. There was a faint, metallic smell, sharp and clean, mixed with the dampness of wet coats and umbrellas. I was alone, or so I thought. The interior of the train was dimly lit, the fluorescent panels flickering in a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. The seats were empty, worn leather with the faint scent of countless travelers who had come and gone before me. I sank into one near the window, watching the rain smear the city lights into streaks of orange and gray. The platform receded behind me, empty and silent. As the train began to move, I noticed the soft, almost imperceptible hum beneath the carriage, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. It was steady, calming even, yet there was something uncomfortably wrong about it. At first, the train seemed normal. It rolled through familiar neighborhoods, past the streetlights and wet pavement, past the familiar graffiti and neon signs. But slowly, very slowly, the scenery began to shift. The streetlights grew farther apart, dimmer, as if the world outside had been stretched thin. The buildings became unfamiliar, angular in ways that didn't make sense, windows reflecting nothing at all, only dark glass and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I blinked, and the view seemed to pulse, just slightly, like it was breathing. I tried to steady myself, telling myself it was exhaustion, the monotony of the last hour of work, the damp, the chill. I leaned against the window, noticing then the quiet. It was a thick, full quiet, heavy enough that even the soft mechanical hum of the train seemed to vanish into it. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, echoing in my ears. Somewhere, far off, I thought I heard a soft whisper, a low, murmured syllable carried on the motion of the train, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. Just the empty seats, dark and waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I stopped counting. The train did not stop. No stations passed. No lights indicated familiar names. The soft hiss of doors opening or closing never came. There were no announcements. No digital displays. Nothing to mark distance. Nothing to anchor time. I started noticing the reflections in the windows. At first, it was just my own tired face, pale under the flickering lights. Then I saw shapes behind me, fleeting, impossible. Shadows that weren't mine, stretching long and thin along the aisle, vanishing whenever I tried to look directly at Them, I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself it was exhaustion. The air grew colder, carrying the smell of wet stone, like an abandoned tunnel somewhere deep underground. My breath fogged against the glass, and I watched as condensation crept across the window in patterns that looked almost like hands, pressed faintly from the other side. I reached to wipe them away, but my fingers found only smooth glass. I tried to call out, but the sound of my own voice was swallowed immediately by the walls of the train. The whispering came again, softer now. Unintelligible syllables curling just beyond comprehension, and for a moment, I felt as though the train itself was speaking to me, mocking my presence. I walked down the aisle, each step measured and deliberate, trying to see if anyone else was aboard. The seats remained empty, the lights flickering in slow, deliberate pulses. I passed a mirror mounted near the end of the car, and for a moment I saw myself. Then the reflection shifted. The face staring back at me wasn't exactly mine. The eyes were slightly darker, the corners of the mouth too still. And behind it, in the shadows, I thought I glimpsed a figure hunched, impossibly tall, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. The reflection had returned to my own tired, normal face. My hands shook. I gripped a seat for support, telling myself I was safe, telling myself I was imagining. I sat back down near the window, hoping for something familiar, anything. The rain outside continued, relentless, now more a solid wall than droplets, obscuring everything. The city had vanished. All I could see were muted, shadowed shapes, like buildings that existed in another geometry, impossible and silent. My mind began to wander, spinning small, desperate questions. Where was I going? How far could this train possibly travel without stopping? I reached for the emergency intercom, but the button did not respond. No sound came when I pressed it. Only the faint vibration of the train beneath me, now slower, almost deliberate. I began to notice other small details. The air smelled faintly metallic and sweet, like copper and rain mixed in a way that was unpleasant and inexplicably familiar. My reflection in the window seemed to lag behind my movements, a subtle delay, so that when I turned my head quickly, my eyes in the glass remained fixed on the aisle for a second longer. Every so often, I thought I heard the soft shuffle of feet behind me, though no one was there. I could see faint shapes through the condensation, tall and thin, standing just out of reach, vanishing when I turned. I felt as if the train was moving through a different layer of reality, one that resembled the world I knew, but not quite. Hours or what felt like hours passed. The lights overhead continued their slow flicker, and the shadows lengthened and receded in patterns that made no sense. My body ached, cold seeping through every layer of my clothing. I closed my eyes briefly, and in the darkness behind my lids, the whispering became words, soft, gentle, insistently drawing me toward them. The words made no sense, but they were familiar, like the echo of a memory I couldn't place. I opened my eyes, and the train seemed longer than before, carriages stretching endlessly into darkness at both ends. I turned back toward the window, but outside there was nothing. No lights, no stations, no rain, like a gray void, like the world had ended and the train continued alone. I tried to tell myself to be calm, to accept that I would eventually wake up, that this was a dream, that I would reach a stop. But every attempt to focus on time, on distance, on the mechanics of the world failed. The hum beneath me deepened. Now, a low vibration that resonated through my bones, and I felt it not just in my ears but in my chest, my limbs, my very mind. I was no longer sure where I began and the train ended. I was drifting within it, part of the motion, part of the hum. Then I saw it, a face, faint, pressed against the fogged glass on the opposite side of the carriage. Pale, with indistinct features, dark eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. The face did not move, did not blink, yet I felt its gaze as a weight upon me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to move, but my limbs refused. The face lingered, and for a moment I felt I had recognized it, not from life, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, something older, something I should have feared long before I boarded the train. The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the face was gone. I was alone, or I thought I was. The train hummed beneath me, constant, infinite. I tried to track its movement, to understand if it had slowed or changed. But the world outside remained nothing, a void, as though the concept of time had been swallowed entirely. I sank into the seat, exhausted, shivering, and felt an unexpected weight in the air, a gentle pressing, like the train itself was breathing around me. Somewhere deep in my mind, a thought formed. Perhaps this train never stopped, and perhaps it never intended to. Perhaps the stops I knew were illusions, comforting lies, and now I had crossed into a place where motion and waiting were indistinguishable. The rain, the city, the familiar world, all of it had faded, leaving only the soft, ceaseless hum of this endless carriage, the faint whispering that caressed the edges of my mind, and the shadows that moved when I wasn't looking. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing and everything all at once. The lights flickered in gentle rhythm, the shadows shifted, the whispers came and went, and it was a Tuesday evening when I first saw her. I was on the bus, as usual. The familiar hum of the engine and the soft squeak of the brakes as the vehicle moved through the city streets. I hadn't had a particularly eventful day, just the usual coffee breaks, emails. The rain had started falling just as I left the office, soft but steady, painting the world outside in a blur of wet gray. The bus was a bit crowded, but there was a seat by the window, and I made my way over, sliding my coat off and settling in. That's when I noticed her. She wasn't remarkable in any way, just another passenger. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many late nights and early mornings. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her coat, though plain, was a bit oversized, like it had been worn for years. She sat down next to me, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her body, but not so close as to be uncomfortable. I tried not to look at her, out of respect, but something about her presence felt strange. The bus rolled along, weaving through the city streets, past the usual landmarks, grocery stores, banks, quiet apartment buildings, the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement, the quiet murmurs of the other passengers, the soft tapping of shoes against the floor, the rustling of umbrellas. All of it felt strangely distant, like it was happening in another world. I focused on the rhythmic sound of the rain against the windows, the way it created a pattern that seemed to pulse with some sort of quiet rhythm. Then I felt it. A shift, something about her posture. It wasn't subtle. I glanced at her quickly. She was staring straight ahead, her hands resting on her lap, her fingers slightly twitching. The thing that caught my attention wasn't just her stillness, it was the way she seemed so detached from everything around her. Like she was in a different time, a different place. It wasn't even like she was lost in thought. It was as though she didn't belong there at all, as if she wasn't even really a part of the bus, or the city, or this world. I turned my gaze back to the window, trying to push away the unease that had started to settle in my stomach. But then, something more unsettling happened. The bus slowed as it approached a stop, and I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft click, a snap of something delicate. I turned back toward her, but she was already standing, her body moving so fluidly it was almost like she wasn't moving at all. Without any warning, she stepped toward the window. Now, I know what you're thinking. She must have been trying to exit the bus. But that's not what happened. She didn't open the door. She didn't even turn toward the exit. Instead, she stepped toward the window, right next to where I was sitting. And without hesitation, she reached up to the glass, and this is where I still struggle to make sense of it. She slid through it. No, she didn't open the window. She didn't lift the glass. She passed through it, like a figure stepping through fog. Her body disappeared, and there was no sound, no sign that anything had happened at all. One moment, she was there, her coat brushing the fabric of the seat. And the next, she was gone. I sat there, frozen, staring at the spot where she had been. I felt the weight of the air shift, the buzz of the bus returning to me, the quiet murmurs of the other passengers. They hadn't noticed anything. They didn't even seem to look up. I scanned the window frantically, but it was still shut, untouched. There was no crack, no break, no sign that anyone had passed through, just the soft blur of rain against the glass. My heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced around the bus again, hoping someone else had seen it, that I wasn't losing my mind. But everyone else was going about their business, reading, staring at their phones, gazing out the windows. No one seemed to notice that I was shaking, that I was trying desperately to process what had just happened. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty space beside me, waiting for the next stop. I was too afraid to look outside, to check if she had somehow appeared there. What would I even do if I saw her? Would she be walking along the side of the road, disappearing into the rain? Or would she be standing there, staring at me with those empty eyes? When the bus stopped again, I didn't get off. I stayed seated, unable to move. It felt as though the bus itself was holding me captive, as though the walls of the vehicle were closing in on me. I could still feel the faintest echo of her presence beside me, like a shadow clinging to the air. The rain continued to fall. The bus rolled on, and the world outside remained a blur of gray. I still don't understand what happened that night. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand. All I know is that I was the only one who saw her. Or maybe I was the only one who was meant to see. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't supposed to stay. Perhaps she was just passing through, like the rain outside. Like everything else that slips through our fingers, unnoticed and forgotten. But as I left the bus at my stop, I turned back for one last look. The bus rolled on, its lights dimming, into the distance, and there, standing at the window, was her reflection. Her eyes met mine. And then, just like before, she was gone. It was a cold evening, and the air had a sharp bite to it, the kind of chill that makes your bones ache and your breath fog up in front of you. I had just wrapped up a long day at work, the kind that drains you entirely, leaving you with nothing but the desire to escape the city and return home to the warmth of my apartment. As I stood on the curb, waiting for a taxi to pull up, I could already feel the weight of the day sinking into my shoulders. The street was quiet, the usual bustle of traffic stilled by the late hour, and the only sound was the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. When the yellow taxi finally pulled up, I didn't even hesitate. I opened the door and slid inside, eager to get out of the cold and back to the comfort of my apartment. The driver, an older man with graying hair and a heavy coat, glanced at me in the rearview mirror with a kind, tired smile. "Where to?" he asked, his voice rough but warm. "Downtown," I replied, settling into the seat and closing the door behind me. I was so tired that I didn't even bother to make small talk, letting the soft hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the wet road lull me into a state of half-awareness. The ride started like any other quiet routine. The glow of streetlights flashed by in intervals, casting a dim light on the interior of the cab. I stared out the window, watching the world blur past. My thoughts scattered like the raindrops tracing their paths down the glass. The night felt thick with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like time itself has stopped moving. But then, something strange happened. I noticed the taxi meter ticking backwards. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I was half dazed, after all. But when I looked again, I saw the numbers on the meter clearly: 8.50, 8:49, 8:48. It wasn't just a glitch. It was counting backward, inching away from my destination. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced, and I asked myself if I had somehow made a mistake, if the meter was malfunctioning, or if I was simply too tired to notice. But no, it was real. The numbers continued to fall, slowly but steadily, as though the taxi was traveling in reverse, retracing its path rather than moving forward. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hesitant. "The meter, it's going backward." The driver didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the road, and for a moment, I wondered if he had even heard me. But then he spoke, his voice almost too calm, as if he had been expecting this. "Sometimes, the meter gets a little confused," he said, his words clipped. "It's not uncommon. Just relax, we'll be fine." I wasn't sure what to make of that. The way he said it, with such nonchalance, made me feel uneasy, as if he had experienced this before. But why would he keep driving without saying anything? Why wasn't he reacting more to the situation? I glanced at the meter again. It was now at 790, then 780, 770. We were moving backwards in time, or so it felt. The streetlights, once ahead of us, were now behind us. The city was shrinking, the skyline becoming smaller with each passing second. I could feel my heart begin to race, the cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I had to say something. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. The driver didn't answer at first, his grip on the steering wheel firm and steady. Finally, he looked at me in the rearview mirror, and his eyes were different. They weren't tired anymore. There was something in them, something ancient, like they had seen too much, too many things, too many years. "We're not going anywhere new," he said softly, his voice tinged with an odd sadness. "We're going back. Back." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking now. He didn't respond immediately, as if he was carefully choosing his words. The meter continued to tick down. 7, 67, 57, 40. The streets outside the window started to change. The modern buildings of the city began to fade away, replaced by older structures, storefronts with faded signs, and gas lamps flickering. In the distance, the air grew heavier, like the city itself was drowning under a layer of time. "I've been driving this cab for a long time," the driver continued, his voice quieter now. "Longer than I should have. And sometimes, the meter takes me places I don't want to go. Places I can't escape." I turned to look out the window again. The streets had completely transformed. The cars that had been on the road moments ago were now horse-drawn carriages, and the people walking on the sidewalks wore old-fashioned clothing. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning out of control, but I couldn't look away. The city was slipping backward, piece by piece, until it was a version of itself I couldn't recognize. The driver's words echoed in my mind. "Places I can't escape." What was he talking about? Was this some kind of dream? A nightmare? I glanced at the meter again. It was nearing 6.00, then 590, 580. The numbers were descending faster now, like we were racing against time. I had no idea what was happening. No idea how we were moving through time, how the streets had changed, how the people had changed, how everything had changed. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. The driver didn't respond at first, but then, as if on cue, the car slowed to a stop. I looked up. We were parked in front of a building that looked older than anything I had seen before. It had an air of neglect about it, a place that had been abandoned for decades. The windows were dark, the doors sealed shut with rusted chains. The busyness of the city, the noise, the light, everything had disappeared. All that was left was this eerie silence, this stillness that felt wrong, like a part of the world had been erased. "This is where it ends," the driver finally said, his voice filled with a quiet regret. "This is where the ride stops, where it always stops." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. My hands gripped the seat, and I glanced out the window. There, standing on the sidewalk, was a woman in a long, faded dress. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but her presence felt somehow familiar. I couldn't place her, but something about her seemed to reach out to me, as if she was waiting for me. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice trembling. The driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror again, and there was something dark behind them, something ancient and sorrowful. "She's the one who takes you back," he said softly, "the one who shows you the way." Before I could ask anything else, the woman outside turned, her movements slow, deliberate, and vanished into the night. The taxi meter counted down. One last time, the numbers frozen at 3.00, and I knew without a doubt that the past was never really gone. It was always just behind us, always waiting to pull us back. And then, the city, the world, the driver, everything vanished. The cold air, the sound of the rain, the city streets, they were all gone, replaced by a vast, empty, quiet. And I was alone. It was late, later than I usually stayed out. But I'd had a long day, and I was eager to get home. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by, its headlights cutting through the haze of streetlights and mist. The cool air of the evening wrapped itself around me, and I quickened my pace as I made my way to the bus stop, grateful that the bus hadn't left yet. I wasn't in the mood to wait. My mind was already a little numb from the day, and I was tired of feeling the weight of everything pressing on me. The city felt different that night, quiet in a way that wasn't quite comforting. A kind of eerie stillness clung to the corners of the streets, the kind you only notice when you've spent too much time in a city that's normally bustling with life. When the bus finally arrived, I was the only one standing at the stop. It was a small, local bus, the kind that doesn't get much attention. And when I stepped inside, I was met with the usual musty air and the quiet hum of the engine. The driver, an older man with graying hair, barely looked up as I paid my fare. I was used to that. Most bus drivers don't care much about passengers beyond the fare. The bus doors closed with a soft hiss, and I made my way to a seat near the back. The bus was empty, save for me, and that was fine. I usually enjoyed the solitude, especially at this hour when the rest of the world seemed to be asleep. The city outside seemed distant, muted by the thick windows. The dark silhouette of buildings, the faint glow of streetlights passing by. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the world, and I leaned back, closing my eyes for just a moment. I hadn't realized how tired I was until I settled into the seat, but the rhythmic motion of the bus seemed to lull me into a kind of half-conscious state. It wasn't that I fell asleep exactly. It was more like I slipped into a quiet, detached zone where everything felt like it was happening just out of reach. The next stop was a familiar one, the turnoff near the park where I always got off. The bus slowed, the hiss of the brakes filling the silence, but when I opened my eyes, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the window was different. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it. But no, the reflection in the glass wasn't just mine. It was someone else's. A person was standing behind me, just slightly out of view. They were dressed in a dark coat, their hair falling over their face, but there was no one else in the seat next to me. No one had gotten on the bus. No one had been there when I had glanced around. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the reflection remained. The figure in the window shifted, and I saw the outline of a face, pale and still. For a moment, the two of Usme and the person in the reflection locked eyes. I could feel a cold shiver creep up my spine, an unsettling sense of something being wrong. This wasn't just a trick of the light. The figure wasn't in the seat, wasn't standing beside MIT, was in the reflection, like it was floating just behind the glass, staring at me with dark, hollow eyes. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse quicken. I turned around to look, but the bus was as empty as it had been when I first boarded. There was no one there, no one standing. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest now, but I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of exhaustion. Maybe it was the streetlights, playing tricks on the glass. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But when I looked back at the reflection, the figure was still there. Now it wasn't just standing behind, MIT was closer, I could see the faint outline of a face, pale and almost distorted, like it was stretched thin across the glass. The eyes were wide, empty, as if they were waiting for me to look back, to see it, to acknowledge it. But I couldn't look away, even though every instinct inside me screamed to do so. The bus continued down the street, its soft hum now feeling too loud in the silence, and I tried to steady my breath. My hands were clammy, my fingers gripping the seat beneath me. I kept my gaze on the reflection, unable to look away, my body frozen in place. And then, as if in response to my growing terror, the figure in the reflection moved. Its hand, no, not its hand, its shadowed arm reached out toward me, fingers grazing against the glass. It was slow, deliberate, like it was trying to touch me, but the touch never came. It stopped just short of the glass, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like time itself had stopped. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the pulse racing in my throat. Then the figure's face contorted, just for an instant, twisting into something unrecognizable, as if its features were being pulled apart. I wanted to scream, I wanted to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I was locked in place, my body too rigid to react. The reflection of the figure in the window seemed to flicker, then sharpen, as if it was gaining strength, as if it were becoming more real with each passing second. The bus jolted slightly as it turned, the sound of the tires against the wet road filling the silence, but the figure didn't vanish. It was still there, closer now, and I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity that it wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't something on the outside of the bus. It was inside, trapped within the glass, behind the window, yet somehow part of the bus, part of the space around me. My breath caught in my throat. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came. It was like watching someone speak underwater, their lips moving without any noise. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The figure in the reflection stared at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge it. But what could I do? What was there to do? I turned away from the window, my head spinning. The bus had slowed again, but I didn't dare look. I couldn't look. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, the rhythmic clatter of the tires on the asphalt. It was still quiet, too quiet. The soft hum of the bus felt too loud now, the sound of it almost suffocating. And as the bus slowed to the next stop, I heard the faintest whisper, just behind my ear. A voice, soft and distant, like a breath, as if someone was speaking to me through the window. And when I dared to glance at the reflection again, I saw, at this time, it was standing beside me in the glass. Not just a shadow, not just a flicker. The figure had taken shape, and it wasn't just standing anymore. It was smiling. I didn't know how much longer I stayed on that bus, whether I ever reached my stop, or if I simply sat frozen, staring at the reflection that wasn't mine, waiting for the bus to stop moving. But when I finally got off, whether by choice or something else, I stepped into the night, the air heavy with the taste of rain, and the world outside felt just as distant as it had before. The reflection, though, it stayed with me, a lingering sensation, a whisper in the back of my mind. And when I finally reached my apartment and glanced in the mirror, for just a moment, I thought I saw two sets of eyes staring back. I'll never forget that night. It was a simple drive, the kind that had become a routine for meal-late shifts. Quiet roads, the familiar hum of the engine, and the occasional soft rustling of the trees lining the highway. I had worked late at the office again, and the streets were nearly empty when I left. The kind of emptiness that seems to swallow sound, leaving everything muted and still. The only company I had on that drive was the soft murmur of the radio, playing some half-forgotten station that sounded distant and far away, like a memory too old to hold on to. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, a thin beam of yellow light stretching out across the asphalt. I drove, my thoughts wandering as they usually did when I was alone, thinking about the day, about the tasks ahead, about nothing in particular. The city was behind me now, the bright lights fading into the distance, and I was heading out toward the quieter, darker roads that led to my apartment. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt thick with moisture, and the windows fogged up slightly with the breath of the car's engine. I'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I felt it. It was subtle at first, like the shift of air, a small disturbance in the space behind me, like the weight of another presence. I glanced in the rearview mirror instinctively, but it was just the empty back seat, dark and still, the way it had always been. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the tiredness settling into my bones, and focused back on the road. But then, a soft tap on my shoulder. It wasn't loud, not jarring or sudden, just a gentle, rhythmic tap. At first I thought it was the car itself, maybe a loose part, a vibration, something mechanical. But no, it was coming from behind me. I froze, my heart lurching, and glanced in the rearview mirror again. Nothing, just the empty, shadowed seat, the faint reflection of myself. Staring back, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, a cold draft brushing across my skin as I tried to rationalize it. The road was long, lonely, and I was exhausted. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me, a result of too much stress, too much tiredness. I kept my hands tightly on the wheel, and the tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavy and thick. The kind that settles in the air when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. I breathed out, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But then, a second tap. Louder this time, unmistakable. And this time, it wasn't just a tap. It was a pressure, a distinct sensation, that came from the back seat, like fingers pressing gently against my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head, half expecting to see someone there, someone who had slipped into the car without me noticing, someone who had been hiding in the back seat the whole time, but the seat was empty. The interior of the car was the same as it had been for the entire drive, dim, quiet, the faint scent of leather and air freshener. There was no one behind me. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car jerking slightly as I skidded a few inches, but I kept my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white, my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, trying to see the reflection of the back seat, but all I saw was the dark, the empty seat. The same seat, the same space, but I could feel that someone was there. The air was colder now, like the temperature inside the car had dropped by several degrees. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I wiped it away quickly with the sleeve of my jacket, glancing nervously out the windows. The road was still empty. No other cars, no lights, just the sound of my own heart beating too loudly in the silence. Then, the tapping came again. This time it was harder, a little more insistent. The fingers were pressed against my shoulder, lingering there, as if someone was right behind me, just out of sight. I could feel the pressure, like someone was leaning in close, breathing softly against my skin. I jerked the wheel, pulling the car to the side of the road, the tires squealing against the pavement as I barely managed to keep the car from swerving off completely. The engine sputtered as I shut it off, my hands trembling violently as I pressed them against the steering wheel. The interior was too quiet now, the kind of quiet that feels suffocating, like it's pressing against you from all sides. I was staring straight ahead, frozen, too terrified to even move. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The feeling of someone behind me lingered, but when I turned my head to check again, the back seat was still empty, still silent. The darkness in the rearview mirror seemed deeper, more oppressive, like it was hiding something I wasn't meant to see. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally managed to gather the strength to start the car again, the engine roared to life, much louder than it had before. I didn't look back. I didn't even glance in the rearview mirror again. My eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, the streetlights casting long, faint shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. When I finally made it home, I parked the car in my usual spot and sat there for a moment, too afraid to get out, too afraid to move. The tap on my shoulder still echoed in my mind, and I felt like the darkness in the back seat was still with me. But when I opened the door and stepped outside, the air was still, the city quiet as usual. The tapping, the feeling of someone there, it seemed so distant now, almost like a dream. But I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was still with me, standing just behind me, waiting. The next morning, I went to check the back seat, just to make sure. The car was empty, just as it had been all along. But there was something on the seat. A single hair, dark and long, resting on the fabric. It wasn't mine, and it hadn't been there the night before. I remember it so clearly, the way it started, like any other ordinary morning. I had woken up, groggy and disoriented, the usual haze of sleep hanging over me as I stumbled into the bathroom to wash my face. I hadn't planned on going anywhere. That day, in fact, I had no plans at all. Just another unremarkable Saturday stretched out in front of me. The rain was falling softly outside, the kind of rain that makes everything feel distant and quiet. I didn't even notice at first how much the world seemed stiller than usual. The sounds from the outside, the usual hum of the city, were muted. I'd lived in the same apartment for years, and I knew every noise that made the buzz of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the hum of the heating system. But today, it was all softer, as if everything were wrapped in a thick layer of cotton. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I realized something felt wrong. The air was different, heavy and thick. The kind of atmosphere you get right before a storm, but there were no clouds in the sky. The sky was bright, a pale blue that seemed too sterile, too clean. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about the silence, the air, that unsettled me. I needed to get out of the apartment, to do something normal, to distract myself from this odd sense of unease that was creeping up my spine. So, I decided to go for a walk just around the block, to stretch my legs, clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket, put on my shoes, and left. But as soon as I stepped outside, something caught my attention. The street was empty. Not a single person was walking, not a car in sight. Normally, the city was alive at this hour, bustling with the usual Saturday morning activity, people running errands, cars passing by, dogs being walked. But now there was nothing. It was eerily quiet. I stood there for a moment, feeling an unfamiliar chill in the air, and then my phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend, asking if I was okay, if I was still coming to meet them later. I frowned, puzzled, because we hadn't made any plans. I had no intention of meeting anyone that day. I checked the time, 11:15 a.m. Everything felt strange, like I was walking through a world that had shifted just slightly, in a way I couldn't quite grasp. And then I heard it. The soft, crackling sound of an intercom. It wasn't loud, just faint enough that it made me pause, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I glanced around, expecting to see some sort of public announcement system. But there was nothing, no loudspeakers, no machines. I heard the sound again, clearer this time. Attention, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 35,000 feet, and we're on schedule for our arrival in approximately 2 hours. We will be landing soon. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was calm, smooth, the kind of reassuring tone you'd expect from an experienced flight attendant or pilot. But the thing was, I wasn't flying. I wasn't on a plane. I hadn't been on a plane for months, and there was no flight scheduled for today. The sound was coming from nowhere, like a voice from the air itself, and yet, it felt so real, so distinct. I turned around in a daze, searching the empty street, looking for any explanation, but there was nothing. Only the empty sidewalks and the distant hum of the city. I walked faster, my breath quickening. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I kept walking, my steps echoing in the stillness, but the intercom voice kept repeating, faintly, in the back of my mind. We will be landing soon. I tried to focus, to convince myself that I was just hearing things, that it was a strange echo, or maybe the remnants of a dream still clinging to my consciousness. But no, the voice was there. It wasn't just in my head. I took out my phone and checked the time again. 11:20 a.m. now. The world seemed suspended in time, the minutes stretching unnaturally long. My fingers trembled as I typed a message to my friend. Asterisk, did you hear that? But before I could hit send, my phone buzzed again. A call. I didn't recognize the number. But for some reason, I answered. It was as if my hand had moved on its own. The voice on the other end was clear, calm, and unmistakably familiar. The same voice I had just heard on the intercom. The same smooth, reassuring tone. This is your captain speaking, the voice said. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened and your tray table is up. We will be landing soon. I dropped the phone. It clattered to the ground, but I couldn't even hear it hit the pavement. The sound of the voice was too loud in my ears, reverberating in my head, filling the silence around me. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to pick it up, But when I looked at the screen, there was no number, no name, just an empty call log. The phone had hung up. I was shaking now, the world around me blurring as I turned in circles, trying to make sense of it all. I had to be dreaming. This couldn't be real. I had to get back home, to something familiar, to the safety of my apartment where nothing strange had ever happened before. I rushed back to my building, the feeling of the voice still ringing in my ears, until I reached my apartment door and stepped inside. The familiar warmth of the room was a small comfort, but it did nothing to quell the growing sense of panic. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I looked around the room, trying to steady myself. Everything was just as I had left it: my couch, the coffee table, the window overlooking the city. Nothing had changed. But then I heard it again. The intercom. This time, it was coming from my own apartment. Soft at first, like a distant hum, but then, clearer. The same voice, calm and steady, speaking directly to me. "We are now beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelt and remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop." My eyes darted around the room, and I turned toward the windows, half expecting to see an airplane in the sky, hovering just outside. But there was nothing. No plane, no airport. Just the same city, the same buildings, the same empty streets. I pressed my hands to my ears, hoping the voice would stop. But it didn't. It filled the space, echoing in my mind, until it felt like the walls themselves were speaking to me. "We will be landing soon," it said, one final time, and then, as if the air had shifted, as if something had broken in the silence, everything went quiet. The voice was gone. The world was still. The calm, unsettling quiet was all that remained. I don't know what happened that day, or how it happened, but ever since, I've had a nagging feeling like I'm still waiting for that descent. Like, no matter where I go, the plane is just waiting to land. The voice still lingers in my mind sometimes, especially when I'm alone, when the world outside is too quiet. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it, but I can't shake the feeling that I was never meant to hear it in the first place. It was one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. I had spent the entire afternoon running errands, juggling a dozen things I didn't want to do, and by the time I was finally done, I was drained. All I wanted was to get home, to rest, and forget about the chaos of the day. I opened my phone and pulled up the ride-hailing app, figuring it would be the quickest way to get back. I didn't think much of it when I ordered the ride. I barely paid attention to the name of the driver or the car make and model. The app said the ride would be there in a few minutes, so I leaned back against the brick wall of the building, waiting for the familiar ping that would tell me the car had arrived. It was a warm evening, the kind of warmth that clings to you even after the sun has set, leaving the air heavy and still. I could hear the distant hum of the city, the occasional car passing by, but nothing too exciting. Everything felt a little too quiet, like the city was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the ride-hailing app pinged on my phone. I glanced down, expecting to see the usual "your driver has arrived." But instead, the screen displayed something strange. The driver's name was Robert, but it was the details under his name that caught my attention. The app said he was driving a black sedan, unusual there, but then it said, "Driver history, reported deceased." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Reported deceased. What did that even mean? There must have been some sort of error in the system, right? I quickly shook it off, thinking it was just a glitch. Maybe someone else with the same name had been reported dead. That had to be it. But just to be sure, I double-checked the details. The name Robert was still there, but now it showed a small picture of the car approaching. It was about 2 blocks away. I tried to move past it, but the unsettling thought kept gnawing at me. I clicked the option to contact the driver, thinking I could ask if everything was alright, if there had been a mistake. But before I could even tap the screen, the car appeared at the curb. It stopped right in front of me, just as the app had predicted. I stood frozen for a moment, a strange sense of hesitation filling me. It was just a ride, I told myself. Just get in and go home. The day was almost over. But when I finally stepped toward the car, the door unlocked automatically, as though the driver had sensed my approach. I hesitated for only a moment before opening the door and getting in. The interior of the car was cool, too cool, with the faint smell of leather and something else I couldn't quite place. The seats were immaculate, the kind of cleanliness you'd expect from a newly hired car, but there was something off about it. The car felt empty, like it hadn't been used in a while. The driver was sitting in the front, hands resting on the wheel, his gaze focused straight ahead. He didn't look at me as I got in, but I noticed something odd. His face was pale, almost too pale, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His hair, black and neatly combed, was beginning to thin at the temples. I buckled my seatbelt, still not fully understanding what was happening. It had to be a mistake. I tried to shake off the unease gnawing at me. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was imagining things. I looked at the app again, and there it was, Robert, the same name, but the details still read * reported deceased. My pulse quickened. The car started moving, the tires humming softly against the pavement, and for a few moments, everything felt normal. The city outside blurred as we drove down familiar streets, the lights passing by in waves. My mind wandered, my tiredness returning. I looked out the window, trying to focus on anything other than the driver. But then the thought struck me again. Why hadn't he said anything? Why had he barely acknowledged me? I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but he didn't look back. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his expression blank. The silence between us grew, oppressive and uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to ask him if everything was okay, but before I could speak, he said something that froze me in place. "You look just like her," he murmured, his voice low, barely a whisper over the soft hum of the engine. I blinked, taken aback. Who was he talking about? "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment I thought I saw a slight tremor in his hands. The car swerved slightly, and I caught my breath, but he quickly corrected it, his face remaining as pale and expressionless as ever. "You look just like her," he repeated, almost as if to himself. "I haven't seen you in a long time." I stared at the back of his head, my mind racing. Who was he talking about? Why did he seem so familiar, and yet so distant? He wasn't looking at me, still focused on the road ahead. But the way he said it, his tone, the way his voice faltered, slightly made something in my chest tighten with unease. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shakier now. "I think you have the wrong person." But he didn't respond to that. He just kept driving, the car moving through the streets at an oddly steady pace. Too steady, like we were gliding through time rather than driving through a city. My heart was racing, my hands trembling against my lap. And then it happened again, the same soft whisper. "I haven't seen you in so long, Claire." My blood ran cold. Claire. My name wasn't Claire. My name was Emily. I felt my stomach lurch, and I suddenly realized how completely silent the car had become. The air around me felt heavier, like I was trapped in some kind of thick fog. My mind was struggling to keep up, my thoughts swirling, but all I could focus on was his voice, so eerily calm, so detached. "I'm not Claire," I said, my voice trembling now. "I'm Emily. I think you have the wrong person." There was a long pause. The car didn't slow, but the stillness inside it was suffocating. I tried to look at him again, trying to see his face in the rearview mirror, but his reflection never quite came into focus. It was as though there was something in the mirror, but the details were too blurry to make out. The road ahead remained empty, stretching on into the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver was not who he said he was, that he wasn't just a stranger behind the wheel. He was something else. Finally, the car slowed, and I realized with a jolt that we were no longer on the main road. We had taken a turn somewhere, deep into the quiet, unfamiliar streets on the outskirts of town. I felt a sharp pang of panic rise in my chest. "I don't recognize this place," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The car came to a stop. My heart was in my throat, my hands shaking. I had to get out. I had to leave, but I couldn't move. I sat there frozen, watching as the driver's hands remained still on the wheel. The silence in the car was deafening now. And then, without looking at me, he said one final thing. "I'm sorry, Claire. I couldn't make it back." A chill ran through me as I tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The window was rolled up tight, and the air felt too thick to breathe. And just as I was about to scream, to bang on the window, I looked at the driver one last time, and then I realized he wasn't breathing. The last thing I saw was his pale face, his eyes empty and unfocused, staring straight ahead, and then the car went completely still. I never even heard the engine shut off. And then, nothing. It was a usual Friday evening, the kind where the city feels a little quieter, a little emptier than during the work week. I was on my usual route, the same bus ride I'd taken every evening for months now. It's strange how routine can sometimes make you feel as if the world is on autopilot, moving in a rhythm that you stop noticing. That was how I felt, at least distracted, tired, almost mindless as I sat on the bus, watching the same neighborhoods blur by. The bus was nearly empty, as it often was on nights like this. A few commuters here and there, some people with bags, a couple of tired faces staring out the window, and then there was me, half awake and staring at the streaks of light from the street lamps as we passed. I wasn't paying much attention to the other passengers, just going through the motions. But then, at my stop, she got on. She wasn't someone I recognized. In fact, I didn't notice her immediately. It wasn't until she took the seat across from me that I actually looked up. She was younger than me, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled loosely into a bun. Her clothes were plain, nothing too fancy, just a black jacket, jeans, and sneakers. Her face was pale, like she hadn't been out in the sun for too long, but her eyes had a certain depth to them, something almost wistful. She sat down quietly, staring out the window as the bus continued its route. I figured she was just another person on the bus, one of the many commuters who were probably going to the same place I was, home. But there was something about her that made me uneasy, even though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I watched her for a few moments, and when I looked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen her somewhere before. It wasn't anything obvious, no flash of recognition, no lingering memory, but I kept thinking, I know her. I couldn't remember where from, and I certainly couldn't place it, but the feeling was there. It stuck with me as the bus made its way through the streets. A few stops passed, and I tried to go back to my own thoughts, but the feeling of her presence kept pulling at me, tugging at the edges of my mind. She wasn't doing anything particularly strange, just sitting quietly, her gaze fixed on the passing world outside. And then, as the bus approached my stop, she stood up. I wasn't expecting it. I hadn't noticed her moving until she was already standing, gathering her things. My stop was coming up, and I half expected her to step off at the same place. But as the bus slowed, she walked toward the door, and just before the bus stopped completely, she stepped off. But that's when it got strange. I waited a beat before getting up myself, the bus coming to a full stop as I stood. I glanced over toward where she had been sitting, expecting to see the seat empty. But instead, I saw her standing near the doors, waiting for them to open. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring down at the ground, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. The doors hissed open with a soft swoosh, and she stepped off. I glanced out the window, preparing to follow her. The street was quiet, just the usual lamps and the dark stretch of pavement. She was walking away from the bus, moving toward the sidewalk in a slow, steady gait. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to her. But when I got off the bus, the street was empty. There was no sign of her anywhere. I thought maybe she had ducked into one of the nearby buildings or walked down a side street, but there was nowhere for her to go so quickly. The street was narrow, and I would have seen her turn the corner or step into the shadows, but nothing. I checked my watch. It hadn't been more than a few seconds. She had been right there, stepping off the bus, her figure receding into the night. But now, nothing. I stood there for a few moments, trying to shake off the confusion, my breath rising in the cold air. My mind was racing. She was just here. She stepped off at my stop. She couldn't have just disappeared. But she had. There was no one on the sidewalk, no one on the corner. I walked a few steps, then stopped, looking up and down the street. A light wind swept through the trees, and the city hummed quietly around me. But the spot where she had been standing, where she had been walking, was empty. My heartbeat quickened as I started to walk back toward the bus stop. I half expected to see her reappear, walking toward me, as if she had never left, but the street remained empty. I tried to convince myself that maybe she had just been quick, that maybe I had missed her somehow in the dark. Or maybe I hadn't seen which way she went. I turned back to the bus, thinking I could catch a glimpse of her inside, but the bus was already pulling away. The headlights reflected off the pavement as it drove off into the distance. I never saw her again. I didn't know her name. I didn't know anything about her. But for the next few days, the memory of her stayed with me. The way she had just stepped off, without hesitation. And the way I couldn't explain how she had vanished so quickly, it didn't make sense. It still doesn't. The strangest part, though, is that after a few weeks, I started to forget her face. At first it was just the details, like her hair or her clothes, but as time went on, I couldn't even remember her eyes. I couldn't remember how she looked at the world, or how she stood near the door. It's like the memory was slipping away, little by little, as though it was never really mine to hold on to in the first place. But I'll never forget the feeling of her presence, like she had been right there with me. She had gotten off at my stop, but I never saw her leave. It was just another late-night subway ride. I had been working late, running through the usual stack of emails, phone calls, and project updates. By the time I left the office, it was past midnight, the kind of hour where the city feels different. Streets, empty stores, and the distant hum of life just beyond the edges of sleep. I didn't mind, though I was used to it. I'd take the subway back to my apartment, like I always did. It was the quickest route home. I walked to the station. The night air crisp with a cool breeze, and as usual, the platform was practically empty. Just a few other late-night riders scattered across the benches, their faces tired, their eyes half closed. The train wasn't crowded either. I found a seat by the window, leaning back as the train jerked forward, the familiar sounds of the rails clattering beneath the car. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the rhythmic motion lull me into a state of semi-consciousness. It was a short ride, about 15 minutes from here to my stop, the same route I had taken for months. But that night, something felt off from the very start. The train moved through the dark tunnels, the lights flickering slightly as it passed the usual stations, the overhead announcements barely audible above the low hum of the train. At some point, I noticed it. The stations were getting farther apart, the stops stretching longer than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I had just lost track of time. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. But then, it happened again. The train passed a station, but this time there was no sign, no name on the screen, no voice over the intercom announcing the next stop. Just the steady motion of the train, gliding through darkness. I looked around at the other passengers, but no one seemed to notice. They were all either engrossed in their phones, or staring blankly ahead, as if they had seen this happen countless times before. But I hadn't. I had taken this route so many times, I knew exactly when to expect my stop. But now, I was starting to feel a creeping unease in the pit of my stomach. The train kept going, farther into the tunnel, without stopping, and there was nothing, no station, no sign of where we were. I checked the time on my phone. I wasn't losing it. The ride was taking longer than it should have. The train was still moving at its usual speed, but something about the way the tunnel stretched on, the darkness pressing in around me, felt wrong. The train passed through another dark section of the tunnel, and I braced myself for the next stop. But again, there was nothing. No announcement, no station. We kept moving. It wasn't until I realized the train wasn't slowing down at all that the full weight of what was happening hit me. The lights overhead flickered again, this time more violently, and the air in the car felt thick-stale, like we hadn't moved for hours. Even though the train was still speeding through the tunnels. I glanced over at the doors. There were no windows there, just solid metal. I felt the walls closing in, the tunnel stretching on endlessly ahead. I stood up, my heart racing. Something was wrong. My mind was scrambling to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the tracks were damaged. Maybe we'd had some sort of technical failure. But as I walked toward the door, I realized something even more unsettling. The lights at the end of the tunnel were getting dimmer. We weren't approaching the next station. We were moving deeper into the darkness. The faint flicker of the tunnel lights slowly disappearing, as if the world outside had been swallowed. I reached for the intercom, hoping to speak to the conductor, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The speaker remained silent. My pulse quickened as I started to feel that all-too-familiar sense of isolation. The sense that something was happening beyond my control, beyond anyone's control. I turned to look at the other passengers again, but no one was paying attention to what was going on. They were all still staring ahead, absorbed in their own little worlds, lost in the motion of the train. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Is anyone else noticing this?" But no one answered. They just sat there, as though this was normal. The train kept going. No stops. No announcements. Just the steady churning of the wheels on the tracks and the sound of my own breathing. Minutes passed, maybe more. I wasn't sure anymore. The darkness outside the train was swallowing the faint light of the tunnel, and I couldn't remember how long it had been since we'd passed a station. The intercom remained dead silent. The train wasn't slowing. I was starting to feel like we were trapped in this endless loop, this endless dark. And then, as I stood there in the aisle, trying to make sense of it all, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the far end of the car, near the doors, a shadow moved. At first, I thought it was just the flickering of the lights, but it wasn't. It was a figure, tall, dark, moving slowly toward me, walking down the aisle. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a passenger. It couldn't be. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw that it was a man, his face obscured by the shadows, his hands held loosely at his sides. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone else, just walked slowly toward me. My heart was pounding so loudly now, I could hear it in my ears. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure as it got closer. But when the man reached the center of the car, he stopped. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. He just turned his head slowly toward the front of the train, his eyes wide and empty. And then, without a word, he began walking back in the opposite direction, disappearing into the dark. I didn't know what to do. The train was still moving, still speeding through the dark. The station that should have come next, nowhere to be seen. My stop was coming up, at least. I thought it was, but we never slowed down. We never stopped. I went back to my seat, my hands trembling. The train continued on. Minutes passed. Hours. I wasn't sure. I couldn't tell how long I'd been riding through the tunnel, but the feeling of the world stretching on and on, without stopping, without end, was suffocating. And then, I noticed something. A faint light. It was small at first, just a glow, at the farthest end of the tunnel. It wasn't the familiar light of a station. It was too faint, too far away. I leaned toward the window, my eyes straining to see more. The glow began to get brighter, but still, the train didn't slow. It kept going faster now, as if we were being pulled forward against our will. And then, as the light grew stronger, I saw it, a sign, flickering in the distance. It said asterisk, end of line, but there was no station, no place to stop, just the endless tunnel, and the light, getting brighter. And still, the train kept going. We never saw the station. It was late, later than I usually stayed out. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had just finished a late dinner with a friend and was heading home. The drive was uneventful, as most of my drives were just me, the car, and the empty road stretching out ahead. I don't know why I decided to take the longer route home that night. Maybe it was the peace of the streets or the stillness in the air, but for whatever reason, I turned onto the road that wound through the older part of the city, narrow streets, lined with old houses, streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. It was the kind of road that always made me feel like I was traveling through a forgotten part of town, a place lost in time, even though it was only a few blocks from where I lived. The car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt was oddly soothing. I was in my own thoughts, my mind floating from one thing to the next, when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the reflection that made me glance back at the mirror. There was nothing unusual, just my face, tired from the long day, the reflection of the dashboard behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something in the back of my mind tugged at me, urging me to look again. So I did, and that's when I saw it. A face. It was almost too fast to catch at first, like a flicker, but it was there. In the rear view mirror, just behind me, someone was sitting in the back seat. I couldn't make out all the details at first, just the faint silhouette of a person. The kind of figure you'd expect if you weren't paying attention, if you were just driving along. But then, I saw something more. The person's face, or rather, their smile. It wasn't a wide smile, but it was enough to send a chill through me. The smile was soft, almost knowing, like they were aware of something I didn't understand. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. My hand instinctively gripped the steering wheel a little harder, but I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I couldn't. I quickly glanced over my shoulder to the back seat, expecting to see someone there, but it was empty. The seat was completely vacant. The car, just like it had been a second ago, was still and silent. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I glanced back at the mirror. The smile was still there, just as faint, just as unsettling. It wasn't a person I recognized. It wasn't anyone I had ever seen before. It was like the smile was coming from nowhere, from someone or something that shouldn't have been there. My pulse quickened, and I began to feel a wave of unease wash over me. I shook my head, trying to clear the dizziness that was creeping in. Asterisk, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. Nothing's there. Asterisk, I told myself. Asterisk, you're tired. You're imagining things. I looked at the mirror again. more cautiously this time. The smile was gone. I exhaled, half relieved, but that feeling of unease still clung to me. I couldn't explain it. It was like something had been there, just for a moment, and now it was gone. But the weight of it remained, like the air had changed somehow. Kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on the drive, trying to convince myself it was nothing, when the feeling came again, this time stronger. A sense of being watched. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if the entire world had shifted just slightly, and I wasn't quite sure if I was still in control. I reached for the rearview mirror again, half afraid to look, but I couldn't stop myself. This time, I was more prepared for what I might see, and yet, when I glanced at the mirror, I wasn't ready for it. The smile was back. This time, it was wider, stretching unnaturally across the figure's face, as if the corners of their lips were stretching too far, too wide. Those eyes were empty, void of expression, but the smile remained, as though it were mocking me, drawing me in. I felt my chest tighten, my body frozen in place. The smile didn't belong. It wasn't human, not in the way I understood it. It was wrong. It was too much. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the face was gone again. The seat was still empty. The car was still silent. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my heart pounding in my ears as I drove faster, desperate to get home. The lights of the city blurred by me, a haze of yellow and orange streaks as I pushed the car down the road. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the smile in the rear view mirror wasn't just a trick of light or my imagination. It felt real, too real. I reached my apartment in a daze, barely even remembering the drive. I parked in my usual spot, the engine still running, but I didn't move for a moment. My mind was racing. I had to get out of the car, I had to go inside, but I couldn't make myself move. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, more out of habit than anything else. There, in the reflection, I saw my own face staring back at me, tired, confused, and pale. But just as I was about to turn away, I caught something in the corner of the mirror. A faint smile, not mine. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, the smile disappeared. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I'll ever understand what I saw, but I've never looked in a rearview mirror the same way again. Every time I drive now, I feel that weight on my chest, that feeling of being watched. The smile is still there, lingering in the back of my mind, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch myself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see it again. It was one of those gloomy, overcast afternoons, the kind where the sky is heavy with clouds, and the city feels muffled by the weight of the clouds and the thick, damp air. I had just finished an errand, and was on my way home, taking the tram that cuts through the quieter parts of the city. It wasn't my usual route, but it was a short walk to the stop, and I didn't mind the detour. The tram was almost empty, as it usually is during the late afternoon, and I settled into one of the seats by the window, staring out at the blurred cityscape as we passed. I had been on the tram for only a few minutes when I noticed her. She was sitting 2 rows ahead of me, alone. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another passenger on a quiet, gray day. She was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with long dark hair that fell loosely over her shoulders. She wore a coat, the color of which was too faded to make out, and her eyes were cast downward, focused on something in her hands. I couldn't make out what it was, but it looked like an old, worn book. There was something about her, something that tugged at the edge of my awareness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen her before, but I couldn't place her, and I quickly dismissed it. But as the tram rattled along, the city passing by in a blur, I realized that I was watching her more than I should. Her stillness was unsettling, her posture too rigid. There was something strange about the way she held herself, as though she was unaware of the world around her, or maybe disconnected from it. I found myself staring at her, trying to figure out what was bothering me, when suddenly, she turned her head and locked eyes with mine. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a direct, intense gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I froze, caught in the intensity of her eyes. It wasn't hostile, just deep, almost like she could see straight through me. But then, without breaking her stare, she slowly stood up and walked toward me, her steps measured and deliberate, the creak of her shoes on the tram floor echoing in the otherwise silent car. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't move. My heart started to race, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She was getting closer, and as she reached the seat next to mine, she sat down without saying a word. For a second, I thought she might say something, anything, but she didn't. She simply turned her gaze toward the window, the book still clutched in her hands, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. I didn't know what to make of it. I was uncomfortable, but not in a way that felt entirely threatening. It was more of an unease, a quiet discomfort that gnawed at the back of my mind. I glanced at the door, considering whether I should get off at the next stop and take a different route home. But before I could make up my mind, she reached out. Her hand, pale and slender, rested lightly on the armrest between us. For some reason, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. It was as if her touch had a weight to it, a strange, magnetic force that held me there. I looked at her hand, and as I did, I felt a coldness creeping through my skin, a sensation that crawled up my arm like frostbite, but I couldn't move. Her fingers, delicate and unnervingly still, curled around the armrest, and then, in one fluid motion, she placed her hand on top of mine. At that moment, I felt the coldness from her hand spread up my arm, but it wasn't just cold. It was sharp, jagged, like something was pressing into my skin. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. Her grip was firm, too firm. Her fingers dug into my skin, the pressure intensifying with each second. I looked at her face. Her expression was still distant, almost detached, like she wasn't really there, but I could see her lips curl into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't kind. It wasn't reassuring. It was the kind of smile that made you feel as though you were a part of something you didn't understand, something wrong. Finally, I managed to wrench my hand away, but when I looked down, I saw something that stopped my breath. There, on the palm of my hand, were marks. Deep, jagged scratches, as if something sharp had raked across my skin. They weren't bleeding, but they were there, 3 distinct claw marks, running across my palm in a perfect line. My heart pounded, and I looked up at her, my chest tight, my breath shallow. But she was gone. The seat beside me was empty. The book she had been holding was gone. She had disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, without a sound. I looked around, but no one had seen what had happened. The tram was still moving, the other passengers oblivious to the fact that anything had changed. I stood up in a daze. The scratch marks on my hand throbbing with a dull ache. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I couldn't stay on the tram any longer. I pressed the button for the next stop, the doors sliding open as I stepped out into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. But as I walked away, I felt it, the faintest, lingering chill against my skin, the sensation of someone watching me from behind, a feeling that wouldn't go away, no matter how far I walked. The marks on my hand hadn't faded, and I didn't understand what they meant. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never take that tram again. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a walk through the old part of town, the kind of walk that felt therapeutic, a way to clear my head after a long, stressful week. I had recently moved to this city, and while I liked it, there were parts of it that still felt unfamiliar, as if I hadn't quite figured out where I belonged. So, I grabbed my phone, put in my earbuds, and started walking with no particular destination in mind, just the intention to wander. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights flickered on one by one as I made my way down the quiet streets. The trees on either side of the road had already shed most of their leaves, leaving a blanket of rustling brown and orange underfoot. The city felt calmer than usual, no bustling cars, no hurried footsteps. Just the soft shuffle of my sneakers against the pavement and the occasional wind stirring the fallen leaves. I didn't intend to go far, just enough to stretch my legs and clear my mind. As I walked, I pulled out my phone and opened Google Maps, mostly just to track where I was going. Not that I had any plan to follow a specific route. I just liked having the map open, a little safety net to keep me from wandering too far into unfamiliar territory. The street I was on felt strange, though different from the others. It wasn't the first time I'd walked here, but tonight, something felt off. The buildings seemed a little older, their windows shut tight, as if the world outside didn't exist. I had passed a few small shops, now dark and closed for the night, but I hadn't seen a single person since I started my walk. It wasn't eerie, exactly, more like I had stepped into a part of the city that was stuck in time, where no one lived anymore. I continued down the narrow sidewalk, past the old brick buildings, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to check, half expecting a message or an alert from work, but it was Google Maps. The little blue dot that marked my location had moved, shifted slightly off the main road, and I raised an eyebrow. The app had never done this before. It wasn't that I had wandered off the path, I was still walking on the sidewalk. A new message popped up on the screen, * turn back. I stared at the screen, blinking. The message was clear, * turn back. I looked around. I wasn't on a busy road, but I was still on a street. There were no dead ends or alleyways, no obvious reason for the GPS to give me that warning. I wasn't driving, either. I was on foot, walking along the sidewalk, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. I pulled the map up again, zooming in to see if it was just some kind of error, but it wasn't. The blue dot on the map was still hovering near the same spot, right in the middle of the street. It wasn't off track, it wasn't showing any weird detours, it was simply telling me to turn back, turn back. I muttered under my breath, my voice breaking the stillness of the air. The phone buzzed again, and I reluctantly glanced at the screen. This time, the message was more urgent. Turn back now. A cold shiver ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen. Something in me, the part of me that felt the need for logic, for explanation, wanted to ignore it, to keep walking, but that nagging feeling in my stomach wouldn't let me. I had to know. I glanced around again, trying to figure out if there was something I was missing. But there was nothing. Just empty streets and the quiet rustle of leaves. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but then I shook my head. No, I wasn't going to let some app dictate my movements. I had the right to walk wherever I wanted, to keep going. But that feeling in my stomach wasn't letting up. With a resigned sigh, I turned around, figuring I'd appease the weird request from the GPS, even though I still didn't understand it. As I walked back down the same street, the phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was different. Turn back. You shouldn't be here. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched, a cold rush sweeping over me. I stood there, frozen. Shouldn't be here. What was that supposed to mean? I looked around again, more urgently now. The street looked the same as it had when I walked down it, but somehow different. The windows of the old buildings felt darker, the air colder. The streetlights flickered a little more than they should have, casting long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk. The silence had grown thicker, as though the entire street was holding its breath. I pulled the phone out of my pocket, staring at the screen. My heart began to race as the app's map showed my location again, the same narrow street, the same spot on the sidewalk. But now, there was something else. The little blue dot wasn't moving. It was stuck. I stepped back, my breath shallow. I checked the map again, zooming in to see if it had changed. But there was nothing except the message that was still on the screen. You shouldn't be here. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to leave, a deep instinct telling me to run. I turned around and started walking faster, my steps quickening as I felt the weight of something behind me. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if the air itself had become heavier, pressing down on me, urging me to move faster. The streets that I had walked through just minutes ago, so familiar, so normal, had suddenly become unfamiliar. The houses, the empty storefronts, the streetlights, they were all the same, but they felt wrong, like I had stepped into some parallel version of the world I had just left behind. I kept walking faster, moving away from the street, the feeling of unease intensifying with every step. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't stop to check it. I wasn't about to listen to anything else the app had to say. When I finally reached the main road, the one that led to the busier part of town, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The sense of being watched, the feeling of something trailing behind me faded, and I exhaled a shaky breath, relieved. But when I checked my phone again, the app was still open, the map still active. The little blue dot, the one that had been following me down that strange street, had shifted. It was back at the same spot. It was as though I had never left. And now, the message wasn't telling me to turn back. It was simply flashing, over and over, as though it was waiting for me to do something. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. I wasn't sure how to make sense of it, but as I glanced back at the street I had just left, I felt a weight settle in my chest again. The nagging feeling that somehow, I'd crossed into a place where I wasn't supposed to be. I glanced at the screen one last time, but the app had gone dark. The map was gone.